On January 3rd, 1956, 3 boys went out for a hike near Wadsworth Park to the northwest of Great Falls, Montana. During their excursion, as they walked down a dirt road, they came across a car parked between 2 trees. Its radio, headlights, emergency brake, and ignition switch were all on, and it was in gear. Outside of the car, the boys discovered the body of a man, face down and partially under the vehicle. His hands had been tied behind his back with what would later be determined to be his own belt. He had been shot in the head. The man was 18-year-old Lloyd Duane Bogle, the owner of the car. Originally from Waco, Texas, Duane was an airman second class who had been serving at nearby Malmstrom Air Force Base for the past 8.5 months, assigned to the 29th Fighter Interceptor Squadron. Duane was a graduate of Waco High School, loved by everyone in his family for his charm and sense of humor. Authorities did not believe that robbery was the motive for Duane's murder, as his expensive camera was still inside of his car, and $5 in cash was found on his body. They instead feared a much worse motive, kidnapping, when the worried parents of Duane's girlfriend, Patricia "Patti" Kalitzke, came forward after Duane's body was found, reporting that Duane and Patti had spent the previous evening together, and that Patti had never returned home. There was no sign of Patti in the immediate vicinity of the car, so authorities began searching out from the crime scene, looking for her. Patti would not be located until the following day, January 4th, when a county road worker found her body at the bottom of a rocky ravine along Vineyard Road, 5 miles outside of Great Falls and nearly 8 miles from where Duane had been killed and Patti had presumably been abducted. The trail of blood that ran down the ravine indicated that Patti's body had rolled down to the location where it was found from the gravel road above. Patti had been just 16 years old and a junior at Great Falls High School when she was killed. She was popular in her neighborhood and in school, and according to one of her friends, she did not have a mean bone in her body. Her classmates described her as witty, fun-loving, and bubbly, and her sister said she was always smiling. Patti was seemingly good at everything she tried, including ballet and tap dancing. Patti and Duane had only recently started dating, after meeting at Patti's cousin's wedding a month before they were killed. They bonded in part over their shared love of music and dancing. While they had not been together for very long, Patti and Duane were smitten with each other. The couple had already begun discussing marriage, and Duane had spent Christmas of 1955 as a guest in the Kalitzke family home. They spent all of their free time together, and the Kalitzkes already considered Duane to be like part of their family. Newspapers reported shortly after the murders that Patti's parents had not contacted authorities as soon as she failed to return home on the evening of January 2nd, because they assumed that she and Duane had eloped. However, according to Patti's sister Darlene, while the couple was in love and extremely happy together, they were still getting to know each other, and Patti was determined to go to college, so an elopement was not immediately considered. Her parents had panicked when Patti, who was responsible and considerate, failed to return home by her 10 p.m. curfew, which she always adhered to. They began calling around to Patti's older sisters to see if she had gone to one of their homes, but she was not with any of them. When they could not find Patti anywhere she conceivably would have gone, they then began considering the possibility that Patti had eloped, as her oldest sister had done when she was Patti's age. Patti and Duane had last been seen at Pete's Drive-In restaurant drinking Cokes on the night of January 2nd. According to the employees of the drive-in, they arrived there around 8:30 p.m. and left a little after 9. They were alone in Duane's car. The location where Duane and his car were found was used as a local lover's lane, leading police to believe that Duane and Patti had driven there on their own accord, and their killer had found them there and forced them out of the vehicle. Authorities believed that Duane and Patti were both killed by the same person, due to the circumstances of the case and the manner in which they were killed. Both Patti and Duane appear to have been forced to kneel before they were shot in the head from behind. Authorities did not initially believe Patti had been sexually assaulted in any way because she was found fully clothed, save for the one shoe that came off of her foot as she rolled down the embankment, and the initial inspection of her body was inconclusive. However, further testing and examination showed injuries consistent with rape, a conclusion that will be further validated by more advanced technology applied to the evidence decades later. The coroner believed Duane survived for several hours after he was shot. He placed the time of the shooting sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight, and Duane's time of death sometime between 2 and 4 a.m. Authorities were dedicated to the investigation, and a massive effort into identifying the killer was launched. Sheriff D.J. Leeper purchased a polygraph machine with his own money to aid in the investigation, and arranged for an examiner from Seattle to come to Great Falls to oversee its use. 10 officers worked on the case full-time. Authorities began looking for anyone with a motive to harm either Duane or Patti. Patti's mother, Catherine, told police that when she had seen Duane the day before his body was discovered, he had seemed moody enough that she asked him what was bothering him. He told her that he was bothered about an argument he had recently had with a friend from the base, and just couldn't shake his bad mood. Authorities held the man he had this argument with, who they did not publicly identify, for questioning, but eventually had to release him after they could not tie him to the murders. Police could ultimately not identify any personal motive for someone to want to kill Duane or Patti, which limited the avenues of inquiry in the investigation. They therefore began looking for men who had been out drinking on the night of January 2nd, and trying to identify individuals who kept guns in their vehicle. 2 witnesses came forward with evidence that tied someone to the murder, and this individual was very nearly arrested based on their testimony, until the witnesses admitted, after hours of questioning, that they had been lying. After 2 months, Sheriff Leeper had to end the full-time inquiry into the case without identifying the killer. The case was still investigated, but the lack of progress in it was upsetting to the sheriff. "I feel bad about it, not getting the guy who killed those 2, he told the Great Falls Tribune on the 1-year anniversary of the murders. "I guess it's just one of those things, but we're not giving up. Maybe this year we'll get him. Somewhere he made a mistake. They all do. Someday we'll find out what it was, then we'll have him." Patti's father, Henry, worked as a railroad carpenter for the Great Northern Railway, and his co-workers began raising funds to offer as a reward in the case, collecting hundreds of dollars within days of the murders. Donations to the reward fund would increase in the following weeks and months, but tips and leads in the case did not. The fund had reached over $6,000 by the time it was dispersed a decade after the murders, with no one to claim it because the case had long since gone cold. Duane and Patti's deaths had profound impacts on their families and communities. The other members of Patti's homeroom cried together over her death for weeks. Patti's family was largely too devastated even for tears. You couldn't even cry, my dad especially. He was just numb, Patti's sister Darlene would later tell the television show Hard Copy. Henry Kalitzke could not bring himself to so much as mention his daughter's death, and nearly physically shut down if it were brought up. Darlene chose to focus on all of the happy memories she shared with her sister. "Those memories don't fade," she would say in 2010. "Nothing will bring Patti and Duane back. It's just so hard to understand. It really would be closure for us if they found the man." With Patti's father unable to speak about his daughter's murder, her mother, Catherine, took on the responsibility of speaking to the press and interacting with authorities. She also exchanged letters with Duane's mother, Albuquerque Kirk Bogle, in Texas, for many years, as their families were now connected through tragedy and grief. Shortly before Catherine died in 1991, police came to believe that the murderer was a California inmate who had committed murders in Colorado. After being told this information, Patti's sister Darlene went to see her mother, who was in the hospital. Catherine was too weak to speak in anything louder than a whisper. When Darlene asked her if she wanted to know who killed Patti, she nodded, and tears ran down her face as Darlene relayed the information about the man in California. Catherine passed away the following morning. Unfortunately, this individual was ultimately eliminated as a suspect, and the investigation dragged on for 2 more decades. While efforts were made in the investigation throughout the decades that followed after Duane and Patti were murdered, the piece of evidence that would eventually close the case was not identified until 2001. A vaginal swab taken during Patti's autopsy was found still stored in evidence 45 years after her murder. Since technology now existed to identify DNA potentially present in that swab, it was sent to the Montana State Police Crime Lab for investigation. This analysis located a sperm cell that did not belong to Duane Bogle. Authorities spent the following several years comparing the DNA from that cell to more than 35 suspects that had been identified over the previous decades. Unfortunately, the DNA did not match any of these suspects. There was no match to the DNA in national criminal databases either. Amongst the eliminated suspects was infamous Boston mobster James Whitey Bulger and serial killer Edward Wayne Edwards. Bulger was considered a suspect because he had lived in the Great Falls area at the time of the murders and had been arrested there for the rape of a 15-year-old girl in 1951. Edwards was a potential suspect because he was convicted of killing two couples decades after Duane and Patti's murders, and he may or may not have been in the Great Falls area in early January of 1956. He denied any involvement in Patti and Duane's case. In 2019, investigators began working with Bodhi technology to use an innovative technique to try to identify the contributor of the DNA, genetic genealogy. Forensic genealogists were able to compare the DNA profile from the crime scene to other DNA profiles uploaded to voluntary genealogical databases and identify distant relatives based on the amount of DNA they shared. They were able to construct a family tree, which ultimately led them to identifying a suspect. Unfortunately, the suspect was no longer alive, and his remains had been cremated, preventing authorities from collecting a direct DNA sample from him. They therefore approached the man's children, who agreed to provide their DNA for comparison. Their DNA confirmed that the sperm cell found during Patti's autopsy had come from their father. On June 8, 2021, the Cascade County Sheriff's Office announced the identity of the contributor of the DNA, Kenneth Gould. While they were confident that Gould was Patti and Duane's killer, because he was deceased and could therefore not be tried in a court of law, they were only able to name him as the most likely suspect in the case, rather than definitively name him as the perpetrator. The announcement came more than 65 years after Patti and Duane were killed, making it the oldest cold case closed using genetic genealogy at the time. Kenneth Gould had been born and raised in Great Falls and worked as a horse trainer. In 1952, when he was 24, he had married a 16-year-old girl and started a family, eventually having 5 children. At the time of the murders, he had lived less than a mile away from the Kalitzke home. He was known to ride horses throughout the area. His name was nowhere in any of the police's files on the case, and he had no known connection to either Patti or Duane. A month after Patti and Duane were killed, Gould had sold his family property. He moved to 2 other communities in Montana in the following years before moving to Missouri in 1967. Once he left Montana, he never returned to the state, even to visit family. He died in Oregon County, Missouri in 2007 at the age of 79. Detective Sergeant John Cadner of the Cascade County Sheriff's Office had been concerned about telling Gould's children that their late father was a suspect in such a brutal crime and asking for their DNA, but found them to be cooperative and great to work with. While they were surprised that their father, who had no criminal record, was a suspect in the case, they agreed to cooperate and provide their DNA. His daughter basically said, "You never know. Some people just have secrets that they never told anybody," Detective Sergeant Cadner said, recalling his conversation with the family. Because so much time had passed between the murders and Gould's identification, many of Patti and Duane's loved ones were no longer alive to hear the news. Patti's one surviving sister, Darlene, was suffering from advanced dementia by the time Gould was finally identified. The closing of the case stirred up a variety of emotions for Duane's family. While they were glad to have answers, Gould's identification brought up many memories and opened up a lot of emotional wounds amongst his relatives who were old enough to have known Duane personally. "It's like it just happened yesterday," Duane's niece, Karen Bogle McCarthy, told the New York Times. "So if I was asked, is this great modern technology a great thing? I would say, on balance, yes, for my generation, a generation once removed. But it definitely reopens old wounds that have had a chance to crust over." Karen was speaking to the media on behalf of her family because her aunt had been in tears throughout the days following the announcement. Karen is the daughter of Duane's younger brother, James Jim Bogle. Jim, who had turned 15 just 6 weeks before his older brother was killed, had idolized Duane while he was growing up. Jim did not live to see his beloved brother's killer identified, passing away in November of 2013 due to a neurodegenerative disease shortly before his 73rd birthday. Jim had been an accomplished musician who served as a professor for almost 3 decades at Texas Tech University, where he had established a classical guitar program, retiring in 2005 to spend more time with his family after receiving his diagnosis. While the resolution of the case caused old emotional wounds to be reopened, the Bogle family appreciates Gould's identification because, according to Karen McCarthy, it conclusively allows us to stop wondering. They are relieved to no longer have to contend with wild speculation and outlandish theories about the case. Particularly upsetting to the family were rumors that Duane and Patti had been killed because Duane had somehow gotten involved with the mob. In Great Falls, there had also been rumors that Duane had been involved with drug dealers back in Texas shortly after the murders occurred, allegations that investigators publicly discredited. Gould's identification not only allows the Bogle family to finally know who took Duane from them, it also puts an end to the decades of speculation and rumor they have had to contend with. In light of their success in closing Patti and Duane's case, the Cascade County Sheriff's Office is now considering establishing a dedicated cold case task force. They hope that such a task force can provide the closure they have now been able to provide the Kalitzke and Bogle families. Quite frankly, that's our duty, according to Sheriff Jesse Slaughter. Our duty is to make sure that we solve these cases.